If you're confused or frustrated by the federal government's policy on cannabis, you can rightly point a finger at a man who is misguided, misled, and a deviant racist. This is the story of Harry Anslinger, the greatest enemy of marijuana. Welcome. My name is David Jolly, and if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, I would really appreciate it if you did. Thanks. Well, if you're wondering why cannabis has the negative reputation among many, is still federally illegal, and remains a Schedule I drug, look no further than Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. This agency has now been replaced in name by the modern-day agency, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. And Anslinger was also the first architect on America's war on drugs. Anslinger's career began as an investigator for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1915, and then for the next 14 years he worked for a number of different military and police organizations focusing on international drug trafficking. This job took him all over the world, but by 1929 he settled back in the U.S. and worked as an assistant commissioner in the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Prohibition. The following year, he was appointed the founding commissioner of the Treasury's Federal Bureau of Narcotics. At the time, Anslinger was considered an honest and principled figure in a political world where corruption and scandal was ripe. Soon after his appointment as commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Anslinger focused on removing all drugs from the United States, including and most notably cannabis. Soon after his appointment as commissioner, Anslinger began collecting stories of marijuana being the cause of crime and violence. He had a tendency to ignore available evidence that suggested there may have been other reasons for crime and violence, and zeroed in on cannabis as being the culprit. A doctor by the name of Dr. Walter Bromberg examined 2,216 criminal convictions that Anslinger pointed to as examples of marijuana's negative and direct influence on crime. Dr. Bromberg pointed out that none of these convictions was obviously connected to marijuana as being the cause. Additionally, the American Medical Association forwarded to Anslinger a report in which 29 of 30 pharmacists and drug industry representatives objected to his proposals to ban marijuana. Despite the overwhelming evidence suggesting marijuana was not dangerous, not connected to crime, and medical support to keep it legal and available, Anslinger ignored such proof and went in the opposite direction. Anslinger and the Bureau proposed to Congress that marijuana and its distribution be placed directly under federal control. Anslinger also used some of his budget afforded by the government to run a campaign on radio and other mass media against marijuana. Anslinger used examples of crimes and connected the crime with marijuana use, thus perpetuating the fake news alleging the dangers of cannabis. Such examples and stories were added to Bureau files called the Gore Files. Probably Anslinger's most famous story was also a story referenced in the notable 1937 movie, Reefer Madness. The story involved a young man named Victor Licata, who killed his entire family. Victor killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and sister with an axe. Officers found him at the scene, dazed and with no memory of the event. Victor admitted to the habit of smoking muggles, another word at the time for marijuana. Officers connected the dots without more and without knowledge, and then believed the killings to be directly connected to marijuana use. It was later determined that Victor murdered his family due to severe mental illness that was found many years prior to these murders, and not marijuana. This was one of 200 violent crimes documented in Anslinger's Gore Files. Researchers have now proven Anslinger incorrectly attributed 198 of the 200 Gore File stories to marijuana use, and the other 2 stories had no remaining evidence that could be examined. In Anslinger's 4th year in office, 1934, the war on marijuana and his belief that it was a serious threat to American society was cemented. His theology on marijuana and its dangers was supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his Attorney General. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was introduced and placed a tax on the sale of cannabis. The act was drafted by Anslinger and introduced by Representative Robert L. Doughton of North Carolina. Those favoring the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 included the likes of Andrew Mellon, Randolph Hearst, and the DuPont family, who all believed that hemp from the cannabis plant would compete with their investments in paper, pulp, and nylon. However, the American Medical Association opposed the taxation because the tax was imposed on physicians prescribing cannabis, as well as pharmacists and medical manufacturing in cannabis. Also opposing the tax was New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. In 1939, the LaGuardia Committee conducted the first in-depth study into the consequences of smoking marijuana. This study contradicted the U.S. Treasury Department's understanding or propaganda regarding marijuana and found the weed to neither lead to insanity or be addictive. But you don't know what you don't know, and Anslinger was not only angered by LaGuardia's findings, but criticized the conclusions as unscientific. During Anslinger's tenure at the Bureau, his anti-marijuana articles were rife with racist themes. One such quote attributed to Anslinger, and way too offensive for me to say, is vile and disgusting and tells us really who this man was. Now remember, this man was in charge of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a United States federal and governmental agency, and was appointed and reappointed by many presidents to this position. During his time at the Bureau, Anslinger's racism was aimed at many people, but one of note was the singer Billie Holiday. Her 1939 song, Strange Fruit, a song based on a poem about lynching, gained the attention of many, including Anslinger. Anslinger assigned an agent to track Holiday after she refused to stop voicing her concerns about racism. In early 1959, Holiday was diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver due to her alcoholism. On May 31, 1959, she was admitted to hospital. Sometime later, narcotics police under the direction of Anslinger visited Holiday in her hospital room, alleging they found a small amount of heroin in her bedroom. A grand jury indicted Holiday, and she was arrested and handcuffed to her hospital bed and placed under police guard. She died in that bed, July 17, 1959, at the age of 44. Holiday, as well as fellow jazz musician Charlie Parker and others, were part of the Anslinger file entitled Marijuana and Musicians. Anslinger, always the politician, was not only ignorant, self-obsessed, and a racist, but also apparently a drug supplier and enabler. Senator Joseph McCarthy was a known alcoholic and in his later years also addicted to morphine. Anslinger was aware of this problem and demanded he stop using, that is McCarthy, but he didn't or couldn't. Instead of pursuing this, he secretly gave McCarthy access to morphine from a Washington, D.C. pharmacy. And ironically or predictably, depending on one's level of pessimism, the morphine was paid for by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics until McCarthy's death in 1957. The supply of morphine by Anslinger was later found out by an investigative journalist who was then threatened by Anslinger with prison if the story was circulated. Anslinger's last years were not kind. He became blind, had a serious prostate issue, and a heart that was problematic, although we already knew that. After a lifetime of arresting, prosecuting, and advocating for the elimination of drugs, notably marijuana, often based on dubious evidence and self-interest, he died in 1975, addicted to morphine. For more videos on cannabis and the law, please subscribe to this channel.